Okay, so now, if you've been going in order, you have gone through one set of poems with a group and one set of poems on your own. It's time for you to take one of your first looks at one of the AP Test's big bad FRQs. No, I'm not making you write an entire essay. We've talked in the first two modules about poetry and how poets can use symbols of death and what those symbols can mean. We've also pointed out that very frequently the literal subject of the poem is not the deeper meaning. It is probably the clue, but it is not the entirety. So we will begin our FRQ experience with the FRQ that I wrote when I was in high school on Richard Wilbur's Death of a Toad. Please ignore that I wrote mine entirely about how the media exposure to violence entirely desensitizes children to such experiences and makes them worse people, and that somehow that poem contributed. I was an idiot. What we're going to try to do today is really think about how we begin an FRQ. It's one of the toughest things to do. So tough that I've known students to actually skip the introduction and go straight to writing their body paragraphs, only to return to that introduction later. This is a really bad plan. Your introduction contains something absolutely vital to the writing of your FRQ, or of any essay for that matter. Your thesis statement. On an FRQ, a thesis statement should involve answering the implied question about a text. For a prose FRQ, which we'll talk about in another module, that will be something slightly more difficult to understand. But in an open novel FRQ, and in the poetry FRQ that we're working on today, part of the implied question is always, what does this text mean? And by mean, we mean, what is the theme of this text? So now, if you haven't already, you need to make sure that you go to Edline and print out a copy of The Death of a Toad, and then read it. So we're going to assume that this poem is about more than a dying toad. We have some hints that that might be the case. Our toad is described as having the rare, original heart's blood, wide and antique eyes. Wilbur writes, he lies as still as if he would return to stone. Return to stone. I'm not Mr. Silsick, but when were frogs stone? And yeah, I get it. Frogs and toads are not the same thing. I don't care. Most importantly, Wilbur writes things like, soundlessly attending, dies toward some deep monotone, toward misted and ebullient seas and cooling shore, toward lost amphibias emperies. Now, I don't know about you, but that's not generally the kind of language I would usually use to describe a toad. This toad is something bigger. This toad has symbolic value. And sure, we can kind of assume that because he had a whole poem written about him, but there's also the clues given to us by the text. This is not just some normal average toad. The portrayal of our toad as having original heart's blood, of having wide and antique eyes, as gazing toward lost amphibious emperies, bestows upon it some sort of timelessness. This toad has been around. And what the toad is an animal, a part of the animal kingdom, and therefore connected to the notions of nature. This frog hasn't been around since the ancient days, but nature had. And while some of my students have in the past, and I think this isn't all that far off, written about the mower as being a symbol of man's destructive technology, and the hobbling of the frog as being man's effect on the natural world, and thus created a theme out of it that suggests that man's technologies are doing great damage to the ecological systems of our world, I don't think it's that scolding of a poem. Nevertheless, the evidence is certainly there, and my students were able to make plausible reads with evidence based on those thematic ideas. I would argue that our poet, who is spending far more time noticing this toad than the average suburban lawnmower would, sees the essence of himself within the death of the toad. The death of the toad is not just a random thing that happens to happen while you're manicuring your grass. It is a human death. For to a toad, what is a lawnmower other than an unknowable, powerful entity that comes swooping in full of destruction and mayhem? And to a human, what is a tornado? What is a hurricane? What is an earthquake? What is a disaster of any kind? To the toad, some unknown hand operates that lawnmower. Humanity likewise asks why. Why did these terrible things happen to us? Who is at the helm? Who is guiding these hurricanes? Who guides this tornado? And yet the toad is antique. The toad is old. The toad is ever present. No matter the mysteries, no matter the difficulties, galaxies, the toad will always exist and continue to exist, as will humanity, unknowing of our fate, unknowing of who guides us, but still there. And so I walk away from this poem with a slightly different theme than some of my students. To me, the death of the toad suggests that death is something that is mysterious and powerful, unknowable, but always, always there. Now, to put that into an introduction is no easy task. Of course, we've learned since probably 5th grade that an introduction has to have certain elements. At one point, some well-meaning teacher told you that you need to have an attention getter. I'm sure that phrase strikes as much fear in you as it does me. You were probably taught several different manners of attention getters, including rhetorical questions, starting with a quote, a big idea, or quoting from the text. Now these are fine if they're done well. Rhetorical questions are almost never done well, but I'd rather you just think about an hourglass. The top of an hourglass is wide open. It's large. It's all-encompassing. It's the broadest part of the hourglass. Consider this the wide world, that the place to start in writing an essay, any essay, whether it's a senior paper, an FRQ, a marine biology report, is to start with the larger world, the commonality. What's the big question at work in The Death of a Toad? Death, and man's relationship to it. So begin in that vein. A good, if sort of cliched, opening to an essay is to start with a quote from some outside source. This would be difficult on an FRQ because it would require you to memorize many different quotes. But that's also why we've broken down our study into big questions. You'll have studied God, death, the average and ordinary life, as well as power. If you memorize one quote from a philosopher, an author, or a politician about each of these 4 ideas, there's a really good chance that you'll be able to use one of those quotes on an FRQ come test day. So your task for today is to find a quote about death from a recognizable and credible source. No Kim Kardashian, no SpongeBob, no Taylor Swift. Start with that quote as your first line. It does not need to be integrated. It's the only time you don't need to integrate a quote into your writing. Then explain what you think that quote means and start your transition. Take 1 or 2 sentences to transition from that quote to your thesis statement. Remember your thesis statement? Or, and voila, you've got an intro. Now the hazardous thing I have to tell you is that an FRQ intro can be as short as 2 sentences. Some introduction of the text and a thesis statement. That is not to say that a good introduction is 2 sentences. It's certainly not to suggest that you can write a high-scoring essay, a 7, 8, or 9, with a 2-sentence introduction. You probably can't. It just means that if you have no ideas and you're totally floundering and you're in a timed writing environment, writing a 2-sentence introduction is acceptable. Okay, that's all the guidance I can give you for now. Go back, reread the poem, and remember, start with a quote from the outside world, transition through an introduction of the text, get to a thesis statement that tells us what the poem means. Good luck.